Welcome to the Daily Objective. A bit late today, technical issues, but we're here. And we're here with Matt Bateman. Matt is one of the founding members of Higher Ground Education. So his passion is education, making education better, disrupting, I would say, education. It's an area where we all agree that something needs to be done, but some people actually are doing something about it, and Matt is one of them. Matt is also has a background in objectivism. He's a graduate of the Objectivist Academic Center, and there's so many more things that I would say, but let's jump straight to the discussion. So, Matt, the first question is, how did you decide that education needs disrupting, that something needs to be done to change the scenery in education? Can you put your finger on what was the incident or the moment, or what made you say, okay, we need to do something about that?
So there was no one moment, but I can tell you a few things. So one is that I was a college professor for a few years. So I have a PhD in philosophy. I was a visiting professor of psychology at this little liberal arts college, and I did a lot of teaching at UPenn too. So I was teaching at these like pretty elite institutions, like where you get very, very good undergraduates, and the students aren't that good. I mean, they are in a certain way. I don't want to badmouth. I love my students, but the typical 18-year-old who is successful enough academically in school to get into an institution like this has a certain set of patterns and problems that is pretty common and pretty widespread, even beyond that demographic. And as a professor, if you take your students seriously, you end up doing a lot of remediation, and both academic remediation, but also just kind of like basic life perspective. You could call it a certain kind of moral remediation, just like where are you headed in life, and have you even thought about it? Moral remediation in the objectivist sense, just like are you taking your life seriously? And even with that, a significant portion of students who I really liked and wished the best for and was trying to help, left college with pretty much no clue what the next step was, and it really spoke to something. There's no reason for that. There's no reason for these students to not be excited about the path that they're on, and even if they don't know everything, that they're excited to go and figure it out. There's a real kind of failure to launch that is pretty endemic, and I just there's no other cause for that other than education, development, parenting, like what happened in the first 18 years of life to set them up on this path. And so that got me thinking about like earlier education. Do I want a career change? And that's the kind of most proximate thing that led me to think like, okay, like if I'm going to step away from academia, maybe it'll be something in education, because I love teaching. Like I was really into education. There are other things too. Like I went to a public school in Tennessee, a U.S. public school. It was perfectly average. Like it wasn't terrible. It wasn't great. I don't think that I really learned anything in high school. I can't point to a single thing that I learned in high school. It's just wasn't terrible, but it was like a colossal waste of time. And that's an ordinary experience. And then I've also had some exceptionally good educational experiences. So the OAC is great. I did this high school program called City Term that was this like funky, like progressively inspired, go and live in New York City essentially for a semester and like study the city directly first-handedly. It was really, really wonderful. And then grad school for me was freaking awesome. Like I loved grad school. You're like learning from experts. And so there's just like a bunch of bubbling things. Like education typically sucks, but it could be great. I even had some great education experiences. I imagine that everybody has some good teachers and some good education experiences. So it's just like I was on about it. It's something that I care about. And then I got introduced to Montessori, and that really cemented it.
This is gonna be the main part of our discussion. So, but what you said about university, this definitely hits a nerve. So, in my academic career, my most successful module was one which was called basically basic skills. And at some point, I realized that I even had to teach students who, as you said, they're supposed to be from the best, because otherwise, how did they make it to the university? Things like splitting the text in paragraphs, or things like why we have an introduction, why a main part, why a conclusion. So it definitely makes sense that you reverse engineer it and you realize, okay, then the problem starts at school. So how do we get then to the higher ground education? Can you tell us a bit what the higher ground education is and how does it address these problems, or if we don't want to see it as a problem issue, how does it put together all these good experiences that you had from great education to the service of the students?
Yeah, I mean, so when I first got introduced to Montessori about 10 years ago, I didn't really know anything about it. And I was a little bit hesitant because my experiences and like what I wanted to fix, I was like, I want like teenagers to learn critical thinking, and I was not thinking about it that coherently. But you know, to be kind of set on a better path before college. And these are like 3-year-olds in Montessori. And so I was like, you know, I'm sure it's relevant, but like, what's the kind of connection between A and B? And the first Montessori classroom that I saw, I really fell in love with it. It was a kind of love at first sight thing. There were all these little children between 3 and 6 years old. And I had a pretty happy childhood, to be honest. I remember doing things like playing with Legos for hours, or like learning how to draw. I love drawing, and I would figure stuff out. I would figure out how to make my drawings better. Like I figured out perspective and shading and things like that by copying other people who were doing it. And I love that. Or like damming creeks. I lived in the rural South, so I would like go outside and like dam a creek and probably cause an ecological disaster, but it was really fun. And these were things that I would do for like hours and hours at a time. Like nobody knew what I was doing. It was just like it was like benign neglect. People left me to my own devices and I did them. And in this Montessori classroom, that's what I saw. Like I saw kids absorbed in work, not the kind of work that I was doing, because what I was doing was kind of closer to kind of freeform work and playing, but they were doing things like writing, like 3 to 6 year olds, or skip counting. Like there was this little boy who had rolled out the beads and was like counting up to 1,000 slowly by sevens. Like this, like in preschool, like you're counting up to 1,000 by sevens, like 7, 14, 21. Like this is what this, and they loved it. They were choosing it. It wasn't that there was some teacher lording over them. And I was like, what is going on here? Like, how do you get, I've worked with children, like I did a lot of preschool work when I was in college. I've always loved little kids. I just never seen anything like that with little children. And so I'm trained as an intellectual historian. So I'm like, I know I'm going to figure out what's going on here. I'm going to read all of Montessori's books and her epistolary and her letters and her critics. And I did that. And I was talking to a lot of people who eventually were going to be on the founding team of Higher Ground at the time and working with them. And there are just so many innovative educational principles that Montessori came up with, from the way that she takes curriculum very, very seriously, but also translates it into a form that's very different. That's not a textbook. It's not assignments. It's not worksheets. It's not a teacher telling you what to do. It's materialized abstractions that children can and do use independently and love to use independently. And the way that she figured out what's actually the sequence of knowledge here and the sequence of skills, and like how can we push it even younger, and like the number of places where she's like, the problem with our literacy education is not that we do it too early, it's that we do it too late. And if you do it early enough and in the right way, so that you've kind of broken the task down in this really brilliant pedagogical way, children start learning how to read and write before you even know it. But like when they're 2 and 3, they're kind of preparing for it in a certain way. So there are all these brilliant curricular things. The seriousness with which the pedagogy treats children, like it's just like, yes, like these are little humans that have agency. These aren't teddy bears. These aren't like like non-rational creatures that like you have to herd like animals. These are little human beings, and there's a certain dignity to that, and a certain continuity with adult life. Like, what does that look like? How do you respect it? The fact that it's like very, very child-centered, but also very structured, is really the key, I think, to Montessori early childhood. And I was thinking about this, and a lot of the people that I was talking to were thinking about this, and we just came to the conclusion that, I mean, these aren't the only things about Montessori, but this kind of thing that Montessori gets right is just the solution. It's the silver bullet in education. It's like the thing that for literally centuries, like I work in the history of education, people are struggling with this, grappling with it, trying to figure out a better way in education that they can't, and they run up against problems, and it's like 3 steps forward and 4 steps back. And Montessori actually provides solutions with things like the prepared environment, materializing the curriculum, coming up with a different role for the guide. It's just a very different way of thinking about education. So that's a kind of gesture at an answer, but yeah.
So, but help me understand something. With Montessori, isn't it that mostly it's the first years, let's say, of elementary school? But checking out your website, I see that you're also engaging with students. So first of all, tell us something about Higher Ground education. So it's not a school in itself. So what exactly is it?
Higher ground is I mean, we're a startup, so it's I mean, the way to think about it is that it's an umbrella organization. We have a number of different projects, the biggest of which is we have a network of 100 Montessori schools. We also have a Montessori training center. We also have a think tank, which I run, called Montessorium. You guys can check out montessorium.com, IUM, montessorium.com.
And also, please, for the producer, put it also on the description of the episode so that people can find it.
Yeah, we have like we're developing software that enables we have a homeschooling curriculum that's kind of so we do a bunch of things. The kind of common core to all of that is this approach to education, which is a philosophy of education, a curriculum, an approach to teaching. It's this really integrated, very, very much grounded in Montessori, but it's our take on Montessori, and we've expanded it in certain ways. That's what higher ground is, like that approach. And then there's a bunch of things that we do using that approach.
So
and yeah, like that includes upper school, that includes elementary, middle school, high school. Yeah.
Okay, so, that's good.
Yeah.
So
just go ahead.
Yeah. So and so the question then is, when you talk about child-centered and all that stuff, these days most people's minds would go to progressive education, which is basically let the child express itself, let the child make it child-centered, which basically means that let the child mostly do like the children know better, or as they say in academia, we're all learners. But you said that it's child-centered, but also it's structured. Could you say how being child-centered is not the same as the progressive education, which says basically let the child almost lead the process? Or, okay, I'm not putting it in the right way, but how is this different, let's say, from the small L liberal education where the child, where every child is right?
So, I mean, the slogan version of this is you can't have a child-centered approach with nothing to center the child. So if it's just really hands-off, like children don't know best. I mean, there are things that children will do if you kind of leave children alone and trust them that are actually quite good, especially young children. There's a way that there is something inside the child that is driving the child's development, and you can trust that. And Maria Montessori talks about that. I mean, this is where, I mean, I actually think that this is where it's helpful to have a kind of perspective from objectivism around, like, what does it mean that you have agency and free will, and that you're trying to take yourself seriously, be selfish in a rationally robust sense? Does it mean that you do whatever you want? Or insofar as that's limited, does it mean that like somebody else is telling you what to do? Do you need some sort of external authority? No, there's a kind of principled structure there. And part of your job as a human being is to internalize that structure and to make certain kinds of identifications about what's really going to make your life go well in the long term. You're centered, you're connected to reality. You're connected to the reality of your life, the reality around you. And that's what centers you. That's kind of like your center of gravity as a human being is whenever anything's going wrong, whenever you have to make a decision, whenever you're trying to figure out what to do, like, what are you center on? You center on reality. You kind of bring in the structures that you need to bring in about your life, about the trajectory, about what's going to go well. An educational structure is a kind of, you can think about the structures in education as like an explicit scaffolded version of that for young people who do not yet have the capacity to kind of do that independently. But yeah, it has to be centered on them. It has to be centered on them and their needs. And it has to be aimed at ultimately creating like fully independent people who can do this themselves. And that means slowly removing the scaffolding over time. And insofar as you can, what you can do for even very young children, figuring out ways that you can trust the child and that the child is making real choices. I mean, like there's no way to develop that capacity other than practicing it. Like what's the alternative? Like, it's not like I'm just going to tell the child what to do and they won't make any choices themselves and they just have to obey me until they're like, how old? 13, 7, like, and then all of a sudden you kind of set, now you have the capacity to do it. It's like, that's not how it works. You've got to train it up and build it slowly over time. And what does that look like? You prepare a structured environment that's good for them, in which all choices are good, basically. And then you set them free in that environment and have kind of light touch guidance and coaching to help them use it and navigate it.
One of my
just one historical point, which is I have a very strong view that Montessori is not progressive education. And just the history backs me up on this. Progressive educators did not like Montessori. They basically kicked her out of the country in the 1910s when she had this grassroots movement. She was very popular. People liked her. And then there was a concerted intellectual effort by Dewey and the progressives and his students, and not just Dewey, but just a whole slate of people were just like, Montessori is outdated. She's bad. We disagree with her. She's doing all these crazy things. Maybe they work in Italy, but they don't work here. It's just not suited for America. We're actually far more advanced. And they were successful. They were largely successful. I mean, Montessori vanished from this country for 2 generations because she didn't like them and they didn't like her. And it wasn't just a personality thing. There were real disagreements.
Makes sense. So one of my questions would be, how has objectivist influenced you as an educator? But you have already touched upon this. So before we go to your favorite tweet of mine ever, which is one that said, school has to be hard, let's go to some super chats because we have too many. So first of all, thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Robert and Enric. So it's not Russia sabotage. That's the reason why I haven't got my cool camera today or why we were late. It was other sorts of technical problems, but thanks everyone for the concern.
It's my
it
fault.
wasn't
It's
the Russians.
100% my fault. So
it's okay.
Sorry.
Oh, it's so we have at least 2 or 3 people who think it's the Russians. So Kmetia asks, what are the main differences between Montessori and Waldorf education?
So Waldorf education, I mean, I can give you the kind of like parody high level version of it. So I'm not an expert on Waldorf education, but Waldorf education is more, I would describe it as more progressive. So it's more focused on the creative expression of the child, on the imagination of the child. Montessori is much more cognitive in its approach. I mean, famously, Montessori, and people criticize Montessori for this, does not think that fantasy play is like, there's a way that she thinks that fantasy play should be at least excluded from school for younger children, and that they're not ready for that. They should be kind of connecting with reality in a certain way. If they want to kind of have fantasy play at home or in their spare time, like whatever, like it's not the end of the world, but there's something bad about focusing on that. And she has, I mean, she basically thinks like, look, what we've figured out over the last few hundred years is that science is the scientific method. It's the salvation of the intelligence. And there's a version of that the children need to internalize. And there's, what is that? And the question is like, what does that look like for toddlers and preschool students? That is not the Waldorf approach. I mean, the kind of famous, like, kind of, again, probably unfair criticism of it. It's like you dance the alphabet. Everything is kind of creative expression. It's fun. It's play. It has to be kind of enjoyable and kind of coming from the child's imagination. You want to evoke the child's imagination. Reggio has some similar elements. These are the 3 big developmental approaches in early childhood. The 20th century developmental approaches are Reggio, Waldorf, and Montessori. Those are the ones that have survived in the West and kind of have branded schools around them. Montessori is the most structured of them, the most curricularly rigorous of them, and the kind of least concerned with. I actually think Montessori is actually really great for creative expression and art, but if you kind of look at them on paper, that looks like the weakness.
Let me ask a follow-up here. So, okay, maybe the parallel is not good, but if you think about, let's say, in martial arts, you say, or I would say Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a great martial art. But at the same time, there are many dojos that are not good, or you go there and you don't get anything near what is the real experience. So, and usually the advice you get is, go do the free class, get the atmosphere of the dojo. If you like it, you stay there. So what would be the equivalent? First of all, I assume you would agree that the fact that the school is called Montessori is not, let's say, a guarantee about that it's going to have the spirit. Or is there some control mechanism who uses the name or whatever? And B, what is the best way to test, is this Montessori? So if someone is convinced that the Montessori method is the best method to educate a child, how can they figure out if that particular Montessori school, let's say a random one in the Greek suburbs, is going to be a good one?
So yeah, the fact that a school says Montessori means almost nothing. It's not that it means nothing. It's a kind of signal that somebody's trying to care about it, at least at minimum, or they're trying to signal that they care. But it's not trademarked. There's no patent around it. Anybody can hang a shingle that says Montessori, and this is a problem. And I mean, Montessorians like wring their hands about this because it's like, it dilutes the brand effectively of kind of what a Montessori school is. If you're in the kind of objectivist world, like that, I mean, there are analogies to like Montessori is a movement, and there's like a conservative wing of the movement and a more progressive wing of the movement, and like they clash all the time about how pure it needs to be, and this should kind of feel familiar. But with Montessori, it's even worse because people say things like, "This is a Montessori school," and literally there's nothing in the school that is Montessori. What can you do to assess a Montessori school? I mean, an easy thing to do is to kind of inquire into the nature of the training of the Montessori educators. First of all, do they have any? Is it like something that they can answer questions about, like kind of no matter what the quality is? Or have the teachers completed some sort of certificate or some sort of training program? Then you can look at like, what is it in general? I mean, our training is the best PMI, but it's usually just used for our schools. AMI training, Association Montessori International training, is the gold standard for a reason. It's the organization that Maria Montessori founded. But there are other good trainings too, and so you can't, like, I'm untrained in Montessori. You can autodidact in it. There are great educators who do it. This isn't like something that you could just like check off, like all and only people who have this kind of training are good. But it's a major indicator, and just use your human judgment. Like, ask them about the training, see how they respond. Are they just like, "I'm so glad you asked, like here's what we do"? Are they like defensive about it? Are they other things too? Just like, what do the classrooms look like? Is it actually set up for a child? And here's what something that I think is a pretty good indicator. How many things in the classroom are inaccessible to the children? So is there a shelf of materials that children can use that is absolutely out of the reach of the children, and that they would have to ask an adult to use it? Are there quotes on the wall, like long quotes on the wall from like Nelson Mandela or Maria Montessori or something, that are like at an adult's eye height and that the children can't read, or even if they could read it, they wouldn't understand? Who is that quote for? It's not for the children. So like, I mean, again, none of these things are necessarily deal breakers, but it should add up to a pattern. Like, is this like a tightly designed environment, like really targeting, like children can meet their own needs, and it's really focused on making children independent, and everything is there so that children can move around it successfully and do things themselves? Or is it like kind of that, and like kind of a mishmash of things that adults that are really kind of for the adults, and that adults have to navigate and adults have to dole out? Those are two things you can look at. There's a zillion things I could go on and on, but
and no, as a discussion starter, I think this is a solid answer. Okay, I have to go back to the super chats because there's a lot of stuff. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you so much, Alison. Marlene says there are people who say Montessori is for, okay, I have to use the politically correct word of today, mentally challenged, let's say, children, not for my children. I know where that came from, but would you explain?
Yeah, so just to give a very brief history lesson, trying to organize my thoughts. In France in the 19th century, there were these amazing psychologists who were starting to work, who were basically starting what we would now identify as special education, Attard and Séguin, and doing really, really great work in this field. So I think you should look up, read The Wild Boy of Aveyron, read some of Séguin's work. Like, I think he has a book called Idiocy. So speaking of politically correct, or The Education of Idiots, or something like that. It's amazing what these people are doing. So like they were like, okay, like what's actually going on in the minds of these children? Like, what can we do to help them? And they developed very specific techniques and materials that, in some ways we're still like learning from their works. Montessori worked with, what we would now today call special needs children at the very, very beginning of her career. And her insight, one of her major insights that let her create a method that was very, very powerful was, a lot of the specific materials and tools and techniques that are very, very effective in a special needs context are also very, very effective, perhaps even more effective for normal children, for children kind of without special needs. Something that you can use to teach reading and writing or mathematics to a special needs student, to a student, that Séguin would have called an idiot, who's like 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or maybe even 13, you can use this to teach mathematics or reading or writing to a 3-year-old. And it's actually easier to do it for a 3-year-old, and they'll choose to do it. You don't have to hold the child between your legs and get them to do it and get them to focus on it. They'll kind of freely choose to do it. But the same kind of epistemic principles apply, like helping the young child notice naturally with a material the contrast between length and width and helping them isolate the contrast of length, or teaching them kind of the basics of reading and writing by decomposing the task into 17 parts and teaching them one by one. Except now, like instead of doing it with special materials to like a teenager, you're doing it with special materials to a 3-year-old who's perfectly normal. So there's a deep historical connection there. And then she tweaked the materials. I mean, it wasn't just that she's using special needs materials. She built upon them. She tweaked them. This was the kind of base. It was historically the basis of an insight that, like, okay, you have this really extreme case of a child who is very, very hard to educate. Can we look at what works here and learn something about education more generally? And Montessori thought, yes, there was. Montessori is absolutely not just for special needs children. If anything, I would say that Montessori is a really, really great environment. I mean, it does actually work pretty well for special needs children, but it's a really great environment for children who are gifted. There's no limit on how, like, if you've got a 3-year-old who likes math and you've got like a good Montessori teacher who's attentive and a room that's really set up for Montessori, that by the time they're 6, by the time they're like in the first grade or in their kindergarten year, that student can be doing like, multi-digit, for basic operations, multi-digit, and even more sophisticated things with geometry, because the sequence is so good, because the sequence of materials extends into elementary, and you can bring those down to a student who already, because everything is individualized to the child. It's just like it's just adding fuel to the fire of whatever the child is capable of doing. So it's interesting that is not an American prejudice, that Montessori is just for special needs children. So I wonder if that lingers more more elsewhere, more in Europe.
European one, yeah. Another question, challenging question. Montessori sounds like an approach that would hurt a creative writing mind in the future, when people want to go maybe into a creative writing field. So would Montessori actually inhibit? Would Montessori?
No, it doesn't. I mean, Montessori is, I mean, we have very, very creative students in our upper school. There's even a lot of creativity in early childhood. I mean, look, this is like, Montessori gets it from all sides. So there's a kind of criticism that she gets where it's like, stop stifling human creativity. This is too structured. And there's a kind of criticism that she gets where it's like, why are you letting the animals run the zoo? Like put more structure in. Like, this is too anarchic. I mean, the reason is because it's something different. It's just a different approach that kind of transcends a lot of traditional approaches. But just on this specific question, I mean, I want to write more on this topic. I wish I had something good of mine to refer you to. There was an excellent chapter in one of her most philosophical books. So there's this book called The Advanced Montessori Method. It was also published under Spontaneous Activity in Education. There's a chapter on the imagination, where Montessori addresses like how does creativity develop, and how does my method relate to that. It's very good, and basically her argument is, creativity is fueled by contact with reality, whether it's in the arts or the sciences. But I mean, this is a kind of Randian, if I might use that term, idea. Like, what is the artist rearranging metaphysically? Rearranging reality, like knowing stuff about reality, having contact with reality, having detailed, rich, abstract and perceptual contact with reality, is the primary fuel for creativity. And if you do a study of creativity, creative artists who are really, really great, scientists who do really creative work, that's a different sort of creativity, but certainly creative writers would fall into this. That kind of ability to be really perceptive about actual human nature and actual human psychology, to understand just different random things about history and politics and what made them dramatic. Like, it's knowledge that gets you the capacity to write really well, even in creative writing. It's not the case that a creative writer is unbound by reality. In a certain way they are, because you get to obliterate reality and decide what matters. But your connection with reality is what determines how well you can do that and how rich and how nuanced your work is. And the Montessori method is exceptional at putting you in touch with reality and those elements of reality that will make you a good writer, like human nature, like understanding your own mind, understanding your own emotions, understanding other people, understanding conflict. Montessori is really, really good at this. So I should also say, in particular, our schools. So Montessori herself did not say that much about literature. famously, she got criticized for thinking, I mean, people were like, where's the literature in your, and to some extent fairly. We have in our schools, and many other Montessori schools do, but ours is very good. We have a whole literature program that is extremely rich and kind of, quasi-classical in a certain way, and that connects you up with the great works of art. We've partnered with Luke Travers. I don't know if you've had him on your show.
Yeah.
Who does great art appreciation, fine arts education work. All of this is, I mean, this is the material of appreciating art, but that's obviously helpful to artists. We've developed drawing courses and writing courses that are specifically targeted at writing, creating the fine arts, creative arts. I think that in my view, this approach is very, very much 100% firmly Montessori. This is not a departure from Montessori; it's an expansion of her principles. So,
makes sense. So I have more questions, but I want to ask a question as well. So I had a very weird life transition from the Greek army and a special corps of the Greek army to going to do a PhD. But every year in my PhD, I was working in the induction, let's say, welcoming new students. And it played in my mind initially as a joke. How funny would it be if we would welcome new students in the way that they welcome you in the army, which basically is, look, here where you came, you're still nothing. And if you want to be something, you have to suffer. And at the moment you are at the bottom of the life chain. Now, obviously within a context, but in a way, the university would give the exact opposite message, which is everything is going to be easy and everything is going to be taken care of and all that stuff. So that's why when I saw your tweet, which says school should be hard, and you had something on the tweet that indicated that you were aware that what you're saying is controversial. I remember this, and there is something to be said that something being hard also calls you to rise up, also calls you to change, also calls you to become a different person. So do you want to elaborate a bit on that, on the virtue of something being hard?
Yeah, I mean, look, the tweet was, am I allowed to say shit posting on this podcast? So I mean, look, it was precise in a way. It was imprecise in a way that I knew was going to rub certain people the wrong way. That's, if I was actually going to deliver that point in a teacher training, that's not how I would.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But here's what I think is true. Some people have really hard lives. Some people don't. Some people's lives are kind of relatively easy in terms of the challenges that they face. Everybody at some point faces major challenges, moral challenges, dealing with medical issues or illness, and intrinsic to the human condition is that it is contingent. The human condition generally, and every single person, you no matter how easy your life is, and no matter how technologically advanced we get, and no matter how much money you have, at the edges, you're always pushing up against entropy. You're always pushing up against things that you don't understand. Like, nobody can understand literally everything. You can answer any question, but you can't answer every question. You're going to face challenges like places where you have to push yourself, where it takes effort, where it's not just like the natural thing to do is the right thing to do. I don't think that it's painful in the sense of suffering. So I don't think that that's quite the right perspective. I don't have this. I mean, kind of emotionally, aesthetically, like I kind of do have this, like, yeah, like, get in there, like, let's do boot camp for a week. It's going to be brutal, but we're going to come out the other end. I kind of like that sort of thing. But that's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm trying to make is activity, the activity of living life and the activity of thinking takes effort. You do experience resistance. Anything that takes effort, there's a kind of, like, you could do nothing. Like, that's part of what it means to kind of expend effort. And you want to develop in yourself a character that finds that kind of finds the pain of effort in a greater sense pleasurable. And that you have the capacity to exert great effort when you need to, and to really push. I mean, Montessori has tons and tons and tons of great quotes about this. I mean, again, her view is not like children should learn how to suffer. Her view is, no, what children should learn how to do is expend great effort in things that they naturally enjoy. And that builds the muscle of expending effort generally. And there's not a separate muscle for expending effort when you hate it. There's just the muscle of expending effort and learning to associate activity with pleasure. And kind of once you have that, then you can extend it to things that you don't necessarily like to do, but you see a reason to do. And as you kind of get more abstract and long range in your thinking, you can kind of incorporate that into your view. But in my general experience with children and just working with adults, managing adults, like being leadership in the company, like people don't like if something's easy, it's boring. Like, and people are so quick to, when somebody's nervous or insecure or whatever, like make it easier for a person when what people actually generally need is to be like, just have the challenge named and like step up to it. It's exciting. Like this is what life is about. It's about understanding problems and solving them. And that's not fun if it's too easy. So I don't know, that's a shotgun of thoughts. But I mean, in general, I think that school, what smart people learn in school is that life is easy and that effort is not worth it.
Yeah,
that's what, if you're smart and you're in school, like, it's not that hard to get A's. It's not that hard to coast through. Like, you don't get challenged that much. And then like at some point in your 20s, you're like, oh my God, like there are things in life that are challenging. You have no kind of character to kind of cope with it. Like that is not good. And so school needs to be at least challenging enough to kind of avoid that.
It's very interesting. This is the second time where you say something today that reminds me Rand's novels. The one was what you said about children doing their thing that they like and being lost in this world. And the other is what you said that I remember when Dagny in Atlas Shrugged introspects and remembers, she thought that school was so easy. Like, this is not what so yeah, for particularly for the ambitious child, school being so easy, you're not doing them any favors. It's almost disappointing. It's almost a letdown. So I mentioned Twitter, and obviously Matt is someone who is winning on Twitter, because if you remember, people, that New Year's Eve collective episode, Don Watkins, who is also winning on Twitter, gave him the award of the best of objectivism on Twitter for 2021. But I'm going to have a whole episode maybe on Twitter, because we have more super chats and we have to go through them before we finish. So
You should follow me on Twitter though, at @Bateman.
Yes, you should obviously follow Matt on Twitter at Matt Bateman, and you're gonna enjoy, because what I like about you tweet about all sorts of things. So now it's gonna be a Montessori quote, then it's gonna be something about funny about your wife and your children. So it's completely unpredictable, and I think this is what makes it fun. Okay, way too many questions. So Bradley says, do you see neurodiversity, IG introversion, better encouraged in the Montessori environment as opposed to state school socialization?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that question, so I'm just going to give a quick. Should we just do like a shotgun to get through questions, or should I like?
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't see the question, so I'm just trusting you to moderate. I don't really love the term neurodiversity, but insofar as that term is valid, which I'm not sure that it is, Gina, my wife, will have thoughts on this. She works in clinical psychology. Introversion is not. I'm an introvert. Introversion is not like a mental disorder. It's a kind of it's one arguably valid measure of personality. Do introverted children do well in Montessori? Yeah, like I don't think that Montessori is better or worse for introverted or extroverted children on this score. It's perfectly fine. In general, I think that teachers tend to, different teachers and different personality types connect well, kind of, or more or less well or more or less poorly in different kinds of peer groups. So if you've got a group of 25 children and a couple of teachers, there's just a question as to how any particular child's personality meshes, and kind of doing the work to make sure that it meshes well. But in terms of the method and the pedagogy, being a little bit more withdrawn or shy, it's fine in Montessori. It's also fine to be like, every Montessori classroom has shy children, and every Montessori classroom has like the leaders who go around and like, rally the troops and cause trouble and things like that. And they're both great. I mean, you want that mix in a Montessori classroom. It's very, very healthy to have a mix of different personalities in a classroom.
So what's the average class size?
In Montessori, I mean, for us, it's probably about 25 for the preschool, elementary age. For
with
younger,
with one lead teacher
and an assistant. For younger children, for toddlers, it's like 12, and for infants, so we start at 3 months old. So for infants, it's 9 to 12 students with 3 to 4 teachers. Some of these ratios, I should say, are not the ratios that I would choose in a free society, but they're also not crazy far off. So like if you look at Montessori's writing herself, she basically seems to think that it's like you want one teacher and maybe an assistant for like 40 students. That's a pretty good setup as far as she's concerned.
Okay.
But that's not what we do.
So Maryland, remember that question about special needs. So she says that bias comes from left-wing Americans. Also, she wants a suggestion. Which Montessori book should a lay person read first?
So if you're going to read a book by Maria Montessori, the default answer is The Discovery of the Child. So the Discovery of the Child is her main. So this book was originally published as the Montessori Method, an Introduction to Scientific Pedagogy. It went through a zillion editions. At the end of her life, she edited it, turned into The Discovery of the Child. It's her in her own words telling her own story about the discovery of her method, and it's a good general intro. There's a book that just got published that I'm a huge fan of. Like this week, got published by it's a biography of Montessori called "The Child is the Teacher" by Cristina Di Stefano. It's very good and very readable. Like I've read there's not many biographies of Maria Montessori, but of the ones that exist, it's my favorite. If you're interested in the scientific research on Montessori, Angeline Lillard has a book called Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius. That's like also a good general introduction to Montessori, if that's kind of like your angle. Like it's not just summarizing the research, it's like a popular work that talks about things that are important in education and like how we think about those things in the world of education research and how does Montessori relate to them. It's good. I have a podcast recording on the Increments podcast that was released like a few weeks ago, that they just asked, it was just like an hour asking me to introduce Montessori. Like they just peppered me with questions. I've been on a lot of podcasts. It's really good, if I may say so. Like, so it's just like a good intro to like what is Montessori. So those are some starting places.
By the way, I have to say, you're the interviewer's best dream. Like your answers are very, very precise, and they answer the question exactly as what these people ask. So Bonnie, thank you much for your contribution. Bonnie asks, there's an environmentalist and DEI element in today's Montessori. How widespread do you think it is? Obviously not in your schools.
I mean, this is a question about the Montessori movement more generally. Yeah, there is for sure. How widespread it is? It's widespread, but it's also widespread in education beyond Montessori. So this is not. I don't think that Montessori is especially unique here. I think it might be a little bit more susceptible than average to some of the worst things, but I also like. I wish I was talking to whoever asked this question right now, so I could understand your interest in this question. If you have a child, like a 4-year-old, and you're considering whether or not to send them to a Montessori school, it has to be really bad. I mean, it can be quite bad and not affect your child. So it has to be like really, really bad at that age, and kind of given Montessori practices before it becomes an issue in actual practice.
Right.
Like, I mean, most of the things that come up at that age are relatively harmless compared to the benefits of the Montessori method. But yeah, like it's always been, since Maria Montessori's time, a kind of activist movement that is generally left-leaning. Maria Montessori herself, I think, got less overtly political over time, kind of as she did her work, because she was more focused on education as the solution to everything. But Montessori is a Marxist. She's a feminist. She's a socialist. There's a kind of streak of that in her. She's an old school Marxist who like loves industrial civilization, and so the kind of modern kind of environmentalism is very like. I mean, it's hard to integrate with what she says, and so I mean, there are Montessorians who just say like, yeah, Montessori was wrong about that, and that's one of the things that we know. But is the movement as a whole very green? Yeah, it's super green.
By the way, for non-American speakers, DEI means diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, last question. YouTube scientists, thank you, Caleb, for your contribution. YouTube scientists give kids explanation using the highest level concepts. How do you get kids to not be rationalist when there's so much influence?
This is a really good question. So here's the way that I kind of hold this point. If you're thinking about education and development, if you're not thinking about adults, so there's a way what I'm about to say applies to adults. Rationalism is the default. So whatever explanation, whatever terminology, whatever ideas, whatever words you give to a child, children are really good at assimilating words and assimilating explanations and using their explanation. And they'll do that naturally and quickly and almost effortlessly, even if the actual meaning of those words and the reasons for them and kind of how they apply and the kind of questions underlying them aren't totally clear to the child. So it is a risk. Not rationalism in the sense that, I mean, objectivists talk about it where it's like this whole pathology and it's like, infected everything, but like holding ideas that you kind of don't really know what they mean, and you're not self-aware that you know what they mean, but they kind of form a system in your mind, and it kind of, you have the illusion that you have knowledge, like here and there in places like it's very, very common. I mean, nothing is more common in education than giving people some form of rationalism like that. I mean, the inoculation against it is the hard work of good pedagogy. Like, so for any particular question that you're asking, having either curricular resources or a good YouTube channel or a person like a teacher who can understand like what is the question here? Why is this question actually like first of all, like is the child actually kind of cognitively motivated here? Do they understand something in reality that's driving this question? Or is it like already they're kind of in the world of rationalism, and that's kind of what you have to kind of debunk. And then if it's a real question, what is the kind of answer that will sensitize the child to things in reality that they understand and raise further questions in their mind that are reality oriented, instead of kind of like giving them a story or a myth that like sounds good, but like, like, I mean, every third grader is going to have questions about black holes at some point. They're cool, right? Black holes, like, it's just so much gravity that light can't escape, and like it's in every sci-fi and superhero movie. Like black holes, like you can tell a child any damn thing about black holes and get them to believe you. Like it's so like I don't really understand black holes. It's so hard and so abstract to kind of relate this idea. And doing that, like, so what do you do when a child has a question about black holes? Like that's a good question. Like it's specialized expert work figuring out, like, first of all, what does it take for an adult to understand it? What does it take for anybody to understand it? And then what is a child's version of that? If it's even possible, what are the prerequisites? If it's not possible, how do you take that really genuine motivation, like the child wants to understand something, and redirect it towards something like more cognitive that's going to ground him and put him on a path to understanding it eventually? Like, or do you just say, like, I'm going to tell you a story. I don't even know if it's true, but like, here are some further questions that you could ask, and just like own the fact, like own the kind of epistemic story, and help the child understand, like, I'm going to tell you something and it's going to sound really cool and it's going to answer some of your questions, but you don't really understand it yet. And that's what you're doing. There's a range of options that you have. And this is why education is a field that requires expertise.
Makes sense. So Matt, thank you so much. Your answers they answered the question, so which is not self-evident. So thank you, and we had a lot of participation. So a huge thank you to our audience. Before Matt tells us how we can follow his work, upcoming shows. So it's Wednesday. So there's obviously the live meetup in London. But otherwise, 10 p.m. UK time, we have Cutting Edge with Dr. Lee Pearson, and that's all for today. So, Matt, on Twitter, Matt Bateman, and any blogging or Substack, or where can people find your articles?
So I mean, follow me on Twitter, and you'll see pretty much everything. It's mbateman. I mean, the main thing that I do for Higher Ground is I run this think tank, Montessorium. So go to montessorium.com. We have a Substack. I publish on it at least once a week, montessorium.substack.com. And yeah, if you're a parent who's interested in our schools or educational offerings, you want to check out guidepostmontessori.com for early childhood and elementary, and for adolescence for middle and high school. You want to look at thoughtandindustry.com. So we have kind of different brands for those things. If you want to get our teacher training, it's preparedmontessorian.com, and we offer online training to any educator that's really, really excellent. I'm a trainer in this institute, so you'll probably take 1 or 2 seminars with me. And that's true, again, birth through adolescence, we have training. So
Sounds great. So, Matt, thanks so much. And we're going to have you back to talk us more both about education, but also Twitter, because it's something which not
I love
many.
talking about Twitter. Twitter is it's a good place to have a personality in public. So
It is, and it's one place where many people in the objectivist universe we could be doing better. Let's put it mildly. Okay,
that's just true in general. Yeah, we could talk about it. We could have a whole conversation. So yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks everyone. Bye bye.
Bye bye.